Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this month's episode, you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and joining me is Jacob Moran, who was last on for our Wives and Daughters episode. Welcome back.
Hello, everyone.
It's so good to have you back. This time we've booted out Phoebe. The previous time it was the three of us, but we're just keeping it me and you for this one.
I think Phoebe would bring a stabilizing influence to the podcast that we don't want for this episode.
Yeah, this is definitely an episode that for me is fraught with a lot of emotion. I've warned Jacob quite a few times that I'm worried that I will cry at various stages of this podcast.
And if you do, you'll edit it out.
Right, exactly. And nobody will ever know. And that's because I've decided to return to the well of what is my favorite topic. And I know we've done a variety of Lord of the Rings episodes on this podcast before, but as I have said a couple of times recently, hey, it's my podcast. I make the rules. And so we're doing another Lord of the Rings episode.
It's your podcast and you'll cry about Tolkien if you want to.
Exactly. And the specific topic that we're going to go through today is one that Jacob and I feel very strongly about. I think the idea for this episode came from me recalling, Jacob, that you were going after people on Twitter who were saying disparaging things about Frodo Baggins, and Jacob and I feel extremely strongly that we are down on the disparagement of Frodo Baggins.
I mean, going after people is an understatement. I had a targeted campaign. No, no, there's certainly a misconception out there and a misunderstanding of Frodo as a character, and many people hold him in low regard, low esteem, particularly in comparison to other characters from the story.
Yeah, I think in particular it frustrates me because it seems to come from people who otherwise consider themselves fans of the Lord of the Rings. Like they will say like, oh, I love Lord of the Rings, but then they will go on to say things like, oh, Frodo's annoying, maybe a bit wet, a bit mopey,
whiny.
Yeah, and then say, I think X is the real hero. Usually they say Sam, and we're going to be coming in strong for Frodo on this episode. I wish to state very clearly that this is no way a disparagement of Sam. I'm a huge Sam advocate.
Yeah, no disparagement of Sam, no disparagement of any other character in particular. Mm-hmm. And I think it's funny as well, some people, yes, are saying, no, Sam is the true hero and Frodo is bad. People also are sometimes happy to say Frodo is a bad hero, but I love all the other characters so much that I like this story anyway. Or there is no hero in Lord of the Rings.
First of all, I think anybody who loves Sam should know that Sam would have absolutely no time for anyone speaking badly about Frodo. And given this fact, I think it should give them pause to think, well, why is that? And like, if you like Sam so much, then what is it about Frodo that elicits such devotion from Sam? Because to not understand Frodo is in some profound way to not understand Sam either.
Mm-hmm. And beyond that, to Merry, to Pippin, to Gandalf, to Bilbo, to every other central character of this story, they see worth and goodness and nobility, and they have admiration for Frodo. Something profound in this story is saying that Frodo is good. You miss out on so much of what Tolkien says if you do not understand who Frodo is and what he does.
And I think it, like, to me, it also really feeds into, in misunderstanding Frodo, I think you are missing what the journey of the book is and the character journey that Frodo goes on. And I think that maybe brings us to what is one of the things that needs to be set up for this discussion, which is another accusation that, again, even fans of The Lord of the Rings often throw at Tolkien and at his story, which is this idea, and I feel like a lot of these are very easy hot takes for people to have on the Lord of the Rings.
Tolkien writes too much about trees. Tolkien writes bad songs. Tolkien writes black and white characters.
Yes, and I have feelings about the first two of those to begin with. Our friend Matthias and I often have this running bit where we say, like, show us where he talks for pages about trees. Like, honestly, I would be more than happy to read it, but show me where, because I don't think it happens. But to the point of our discussion today, yes, this question of, I love the world that Tolkien builds, or I love the narrative that happens, but there's this kind of question mark over the way that Tolkien portrays and writes characters. And a lot of people will even sort of like almost give a bad reading of what he does, but give it a good perspective. Like, they don't operate like people because they're in myths or they're in legends. And I have like a very strong opinion that, the Silmarillion represents how people act in myths, but not the Lord of the Rings at all. And that so that even when people are sort of excusing it, they're still sort of admitting something, which is that like, yes, I know this, the characters in Lord of the Rings are two-dimensional or black and white, or they don't go on journeys, they don't change, they're just exactly who they are at the start of the story versus the end. And again, I find it almost baffling when I read Lord of the Rings, because that is not my experience of reading those books at all. Like, not even a little bit.
I read these books and I see my friends, I see people who I've seen go through terrible things or difficult decisions. I see people who I don't like, or people who are far away from me, but I see people all over these pages. They're deep, they're complicated. The wise make mistakes. The good are forced into impossible situations and choose the wrong thing. Everyone is nuanced and complicated, and I love them. They're so expertly wrought and deeply told. And I think a big part of it is the style in which Tolkien writes them is not hand-holding. And I don't mean to be condescending, but Tolkien puts in a lot of subtle detail about characters and about their motivations, and it can be in very small word choices that tell you the deep things going on inside them. And if you skate across the surface, you will miss some of those things. And sometimes he lays it out a little clearer, but that might be at the end of the third book. And then you go back and you see all the little words that told you the truth of it all the way along. It is in there to be read.
Absolutely. And I think you're so right that you do have to be paying attention, but that's not a fault of writing.
No, it's a gift of writing. It's beautiful that it isn't, and then Frodo was brave and did a thing, and then he felt conflicted, and it's literature, it's beautiful, and it is far more like real life for its confusion and its the fact that Frodo has so many things battling in his mind and his heart and in the world around him. That's far more real than simply giving us and telling us that he is a heroic character.
Right. And I think that's actually interesting, because it's made me think that I think a lot of the changes that happens to the characters happens on the inside, and Tolkien doesn't do a huge amount. He does more than people kind of credit him with, but he doesn't do a huge amount of like the internal monologue of characters or giving you the insight into their thoughts. Again, I think people act like he doesn't do this at all, and that's not true. But he, like you said with the hand-holding, that these changes occur on the inside, and we're not given a blow-by-blow account of those inside interior moments all the time. And so, again, like you said, you have to look for it, you have to infer it. And I think the other way in which people talk about these characters as quote-unquote being like simply wrought is in juxtaposition to other choices or other renderings of characters. Or like, I think a very modern approach to like kind of what I consider shock and awe storytelling, which is to take characters who you think are going to do a good thing and then they do a bad thing. And that's shocking, but it's also realistic. And obviously, I think most people listening will jump to the typical comparison point, which is Game of Thrones. And I think even there is a long George.R.R. Martin quote where he even like posits himself in this position of saying, I love Lord of the Rings, but those characters are really basic and my characters act in believable and interesting ways versus the Lord of the Rings. Now, Jacob and I've read one of the books, you've read two, and I'm not typically interested, especially on this podcast, of coming on and just complaining about somebody else's style of writing or like what somebody else is doing. And that's not what we're aiming to do here. And obviously neither of us have the full scope of those books to critique how those characters work. But I disagree with how even George.R.R. Martin presents how he writes those characters, and especially in the way that it's sort of demeaning or detrimental to the way that Tolkien portrays them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's been set up as an attack on Tolkien, and this is more a robust defense of Tolkien and Tolkien's writing and Tolkien's understanding of people and the world and life, than coming around and complaining about George.R.R. Martin's writing. But for anyone venturing into the world of George.R.R. Martin, one sees a world populated by people making horrible decisions and really brutal, savage decisions constantly, and a world with a really cutthroat morality and utilitarian kind of space. And Tolkien is often again pitched as this legendary mythic writer where, you know, there are only noble good people and stark evil people, when in reality there's a vast cast of characters who are in many shades of grey, many of whom are striving for the good and mucking it up as they go, and many of whom are evil yet complicated and have the capacity to come back. And it feels like a fuller board, a fuller table, perhaps, than a world where simply everyone is fighting for power and death and doing horrible things along the way. And that's not to say that people don't make the decisions that George.R.R. Martin portrays in his books.
Yeah, I think it's a real mistake when reading Tolkien to think that the summation of evil that happens in the story is restricted to the orcs. Although I was rereading, and I'll say this now, I've often said that like my favorite of the books of Lord of the Rings, in counting them as like the Fellowship being 2 books, the Two Towers being 2 books, that my very favorite is the very first book where they set out from Hobbiton. And I think we're going to talk a lot about how it sets up those characters in those times. And I just love that the sense of ambience in that section. But actually, to narrow it down further than that, if I could pick, it's 3 chapters that are my absolute favorite in the whole book, is not in that section at all. It's actually the end 3 chapters of the Two Towers, which happen in the movies. It happens in The Return of the King, which is the Morgul Vale, going past Minas Morgul, up the stairs of Cirith Ungol, then you get to Shelob's lair, and then finally you get the chapter called The Choices of Master Samwise. And within those 3 chapters, there's just this really deep wealth of landscape setting, which I think is so striking and so ominous and so creepy. But you also have incredible moments. It's when Sam and Frodo have this discussion, which again, people who love the films as I do love, it's in a slightly different space, but talking about the great stories and how they go on and their place in those stories. And then this great battle with the evil of Shelob, and then this decision that like Sam has to make afterwards. To me, that passage is so expertly wrought. But at the very end of it, and I was just re-listening to it and preparing for this podcast, is Sam listening to the discussion of Shagrat and Gorbak, isn't it? The 2 orcs. And even they have like a little personality thing where it's like, oh, you and I are going to go off and set up our own little dominion and get away from all of these people telling us what to do. So like even in the moments that we get actual discussion between the orcs, you can actually see more character and personality than just saying the orcs are evil and they're totally expendable. And I'm not saying that the orcs are redeemable, but there is more to them than just they're straight evil with no character nuance. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point. But I think it's a real mistake to say in the books there's the evil characters and that's Sauron and the orcs, and that's like straightforward. And then there's the good characters and they're all the men and the hobbits and the elves. Because to me, when reading it, what is so striking is the wrestling between good and evil in each person. And more crucially, as maybe opposed to what my experience of Game of Thrones was, which, like you said, is very self-interested, very cutthroat, very like choosing the most aggressive and evil choice regularly. And actually what I think Tolkien does is he really shows how evil can prey on good motives and tempt you to choose things that both are good or seem good, and the strength and virtue that is required to discern what is actually the right thing to choose in that moment. And I think for us, like recording this, is really fitting. We're recording this on the first Sunday of Lent. We've just had the gospel of Jesus in the desert and being tempted by Satan. And obviously, this episode is coming out in Lent. It's very appropriate for all of Lent. Jesus in the wilderness, Frodo in Mordor. These are very pertinent comparisons. But I think it's so important to recognize that when Satan tempts Jesus, he doesn't tempt him with evil things or even evil actions to achieve good things. He just offers him bread. He offers him the power that is rightly his. It's not about tempting him to do evil. It's tempting him to do good for the wrong reasons, or enjoy goods for the wrong reasons.
And I was saying earlier, with this reading, we're so tempted to jump to the power and the greed and the things that can be inferred from the offers of Satan, but we more rarely go, no, these were things that were rightfully within Jesus' power and good things. It is good for Jesus to have power, and it is good for Jesus to, as a man there, it was good for him to eat. They weren't bad things. And for us to think about what good things are right to choose, rather than just looking at things as good and bad. And Tolkien takes us there. Tolkien understands that nuance and shows us characters who constantly have to wrestle with that and often get it wrong.
Yeah, I think I've talked about this before, but there's I have this idea that I haven't fully teased out, but on some level I think Éowyn choosing to go to the Battle of Pelennor is the wrong choice, even though she ends up doing a good and necessary thing. Because again, she's wrestling with various goods. And I think maybe to go from there, because I think there are the characters that get singled out as having these struggles, like Boromir or Éowyn, and they are generally seen as interesting or likable to a certain extent. So maybe we can talk a little bit about why does Frodo get singled out for his perhaps lack of this quote-unquote likability.
Yes, I saw someone on Tumblr talking about perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of a piece of media in the world, which was a YouTube comment saying that Frodo was overrated. He never even kills anyone. And to look at The Lord of the Rings and to think that the action, the battles are what confers interest on a character or depth on a character is a fundamental misunderstanding of the work, if that needs to be said.
Yeah.
But certainly, it is a work filled with grand action pieces and, glorious battles and big set pieces, and some of the characters get the more varied and interesting aspects of the quest. Merry and Pippin go on a far more varied journey than Frodo and Sam. Frodo and Sam get misery after misery after misery, And yeah, there's a lot more going on for them as they meet Ents and deal with Saruman and are kidnapped and, go to the respective kingdoms and then, again, Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, they have a lot more places to go and things to do and say and meet.
Yeah.
Whereas, and the boys are in a bog again.
Yeah.
Now they're climbing a mountain.
I think I was really struck. There was one of the quotes we were going through before recording this where it specifically calls out the date and what all of the different people are doing at that time in these dates. And I think it says that date is March 14th. And I always think of the 25th of March in terms of the Lord of the Rings, because that's when the ring is destroyed. It's the Feast of the Annunciation. So I always have that date in my mind. And when you were reading it out, I don't know if you want to have it here.
This is Sam. I wonder if they think of us at all, he said, and what is happening to them all the way there. Out westward in the world it was drawing to noon upon the 14th day of March in the Shire reckoning, and even now Aragorn was leading the Black Fleet from Pelargir, and Merry was riding with the Rohirrim down the Stonewain Valley, while in Minas Tirith flames were rising, and Pippin watched the madness growing in the eyes of Denethor. Yet amid all their cares and fear, the thoughts of their friends turned constantly to Frodo and Sam. They were not forgotten, but they were far beyond aid, and no thought could yet bring any help to Samwise Hamfast's son. He was utterly alone.
And I think about that because I think you hear what all of them are doing and you know how much literal space they all have to travel and how much they're going to do and what interactions all of those characters are going to have. And then you look at the map of where Sam and Frodo are at that point and where they have to go. And in the 10 days, because I think, and again, I was just re-listening to the section where Pippin is talking to Denethor, and it's only been 13 days since the death of Boromir, and you've had all of the Battle of Helm's Deep, you've had all of the Battle of Orthanc, you've had all of these things in 13 days. So that gets them to Gondor, and then at this point you've got another 11 days until the ring is destroyed. And Sam and Frodo have this absolutely tiny amount of space to traverse. What they're doing is like so like physically small in the space of everything that's happening in the story, and yet it's the hardest part. Like they have the hardest task. But it's so funny to me, like in terms of the journey that they go on, like you said, it's absolutely trudging across another tiny bit of land and another tiny bit of land, and everybody else seems to be flying all around the place.
Another thing I think of when I think of why Frodo gets singled out is, I suppose, what people perceive as the goals of each member of the Fellowship. Aragorn, for example, as a member of the Fellowship, his goal is the same as any other member. All the members of the Fellowship are to support the ring bearer for as long as they are willing to support him, basically. But people think of Aragorn's great sort of quest to reconcile himself with his destiny and become the king of Gondor and take back the sword, reforge the sword and claim his destiny and marry Arwen. And he's got this big thing going on. And Merry and Pippin, despite coming from the same place that Frodo and Sam come from, they get caught up into these larger cares of Rohan and Gondor and find themselves face to face with a lot of, again, very big characters, with the royal family of Rohan, with King Theoden, with Éowyn and Éomer, and then for Pippin in Gondor, dealing with the madness of Denethor and realizing what it means to defend a kingdom and to pledge yourself to something and to a cause and to a place. So they seem to have, not only maybe more varied concerns, more interesting concerns than, Frodo and Sam set out to do the one thing and then to go home. And they don't get those interesting side quests. Even, I would say, getting kidnapped on the part of Merry and Pippin is like, provides, some comedic relief. No, like it is a I don't even know what to call it. It's more than the single task that Frodo and Sam doggedly pursue.
Yeah.
And while we hear there that, all the other members of the Fellowship, everything they do, all their thoughts are with Frodo and Sam, and they do everything for Frodo and Sam in their own places. But Frodo and Sam have the hard task of just going at it.
Yeah. And I think maybe to pull out again where Frodo, it comes in for scrutiny is the way in which he's sort of different from the other hobbits. And I think it's really important because I think it's easy for us to read and see the films with the start of the Shire and the hobbits and have this very idyllic view of what hobbits are and how they live. But in some ways, I think it's a mistake to too highly regard hobbits in general. And I think even Tolkien makes this distinction that like the hobbits, he says in one of his letters that the hobbits that we spend time with are in some ways not the usual hobbits. He says we only meet exceptional hobbits in close companionship. Those who had a grace or a gift, a vision of beauty and a reverence for things nobler than themselves, at war with their rustic self-satisfaction. Imagine Sam without his education by Bilbo and his fascinations with things elvish. Not difficult. The Cotton family and the Gaffer, when the travellers return, are a sufficient glimpse. And we'll come back to Sam in a minute, but I think that that's important because so first of all, the 4 hobbits that we're dealing with already are not the typical hobbits. Like if we were to have this story with the Cottons and the Gaffers, we simply wouldn't have it. I mean, the point is that like in the books, we have Fatty Bolger, who is a devoted friend of Frodo and does have his own like little moment of heroism and bravery, but ultimately does not go on the quest because he is a more normal hobbit. He is a more standard hobbit. So first of all, I think we shouldn't judge hobbits by the standards of the 4 that happen to go on the quest because it's self-selecting. Only an extraordinary hobbit would even choose to go outside of the Shire at all. But within that, I think Frodo himself is the least hobbity hobbit. And so we love hobbits, and so he feels like the least like a hobbit, and so ergo he's the least likable of the hobbits. And again, I think there's something true in it, in that he is less homely, less reassuring, less immediate than some of the other hobbits. The other hobbits are at times, and I think Jacob, you've pulled out some quotes which show Frodo's humanity and his likability that we'll come to later, but he is at times less funny or less familiar than the other hobbits. And you know, there's a quote from Tolkien's letters where, and like it almost sounds kind of harsh, although I do point out that he hasn't actually finished writing the books when he says this, but there's a slight element of it feels like a distance even between Tolkien and Frodo. But I think it actually gets at something very important. He says, Sam is the most closely drawn character, the successor to Bilbo of the first book, the genuine hobbit. Frodo is not so interesting because he has to be high-minded and has, as it were, a vocation. The book will probably end with Sam. Frodo will naturally become too ennobled and rarefied by the achievement of the great quest and will pass west with all the great figures. But Sam will settle down to the Shire and gardens and inns. And he even says that like Frodo is not intended to be another Bilbo, though his opening style is not wholly unkin. And then he says, but he is rather a study of a hobbit broken by the burden of fear and horror, broken down, and in the end made into something quite different. None of the hobbits come out of it pure Shire fashion. But I think even further than that, it's not just that Frodo is unlike Bilbo because he becomes broken by his quest, but that Frodo is called to a more noble quest than Bilbo's because he is called to a higher pursuit of moral excellence and responds to that in a way that I don't think any of the other hobbits would or even could. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of one of my other all-time favorite books, which is The Once and Future King, where I think I've referenced this before, but the character of Galahad, in some ways it's quite amusing. They all go on the quest for the Grail and all of the other knights end up just being very fed up with every time they come across Galahad because he's so unwarm and unfriendly and he just does the right thing and he sort of mows them down in his path for righteousness. And Frodo certainly isn't anywhere near that kind of unlikability, but Galahad's father Lancelot says when he hears that people dislike him and describe him as inhuman, and he says, he is inhuman, he said at last, but why should he be human? Are angels supposed to be human? Do you think that if the Archangel Michael were to come here this minute, he would say, what charming weather we are having, won't you have a glass of whiskey? And then he goes on to say, Arthur, you mustn't feel that I'm being rude when I say this. You must remember that I have been away in strange and desert places, sometimes quite alone, sometimes in a boat with nobody but God and the whistling sea. A lot of things which you and Jenny say even seem to me to be needless, strange noises, empty. You know what I mean. How are you? Do sit down. What nice weather we are having. What does it matter? People talk far too much. Where I have been, where Galahad is, it is a waste of time to have manners. Manners are only needed between people to keep their empty affairs in working order. Manners make it the man, you know, but not God. So you can understand how Galahad may have seemed inhuman and mannerless and so on to the people who were buzzing and clacking about him. He was far away in spirit, living on desert islands, in silence with eternity.
Oh.
Which, like I said, I don't think that fully describes Frodo. I think
No.
he's much more human than that. But there is a sense in which he has been set apart for a nobler path in life. And in some ways that makes people misunderstand him. And for some people, they respond with love because they can see it in him. And I think it's very different from saying he's like a chosen one in the strict sense of like fantasy storytelling. But that God calls certain people on certain paths, and with the greater, more noble and the more important task that he's called to comes this slightly more aloof, more set aside temperament.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in comparisons, we also get comparisons between Frodo and Bilbo, and the fun of Bilbo, the romp that is the Hobbit. But you do have to look at it in context. You have to look at what Bilbo was called to and what Bilbo knew he had, which will come up again. But Bilbo went on a bit of a jaunt, a bit of a romp, and it was very important, and there were large world stakes involved, and magic and destiny and all kinds of things ongoing. But for Bilbo, it was the experience of going on an adventure and returning with an oddity, a magic ring he found that turned you invisible. And he lived with that oddity for many years. Frodo is initiated into a totally different world when he is told what the ring truly is. And from that moment, nothing can be the same. And it isn't. Not only because the enemy is searching for his ring, and that changes the nature of the ring itself and what it is doing to anyone who might have it, but also because the knowledge of what the ring is must inevitably change one's relationship with it. So Frodo is, in a completely different world to Bilbo from the moment the ring is passed on to him, and then from the moment Gandalf explains to him what the ring truly is. And he has to deal with, an entirely different world and set of consequences than Bilbo ever did.
Yeah, and I think, I'm trying to see if I can find the quote here, but I know Tolkien says of Frodo that, like, perhaps nobody could have taken it as far. I have it here. Frodo deserved all honor because he spent every drop of his power of will and body, and that was just sufficient to bring him to the destined point and no further. Few others, possibly no others of his time, would have got so far. Yeah, and I think that's because he has to draw within himself a level of virtue and a level of goodness and self-sacrifice that nobody else in the stories is called to. And where it comes in, and I'm just going to contrast him a little bit with Sam. Again, I love Sam. I think Sam does an amazing role in where he is supposed to be. But Sam was never going to be in a position to carry the ring. And, he has it for a couple of hours. And even then, it transforms him and takes him out of himself. But I think that, like, even for Sam is made better by the influence of actually Bilbo, as we've said, who educated him, but also Frodo, and that he wouldn't even be the person that he is without this better influence of Frodo. And in the letters, Tolkien writes, Sam is meant to be lovable and laughable. Some readers he irritates and even infuriates. I can well understand it. All hobbits at times affect me in the same way, though I remain very fond of them. But Sam can be very trying. He is a more representative hobbit than any others that we have seen much of, and he is consequently a stronger ingredient of that quality which even some hobbits found at times hard to bear. A vulgarity, by which I do not mean a mere down-to-earthiness, a mental myopia which is proud of itself, a smugness in varying degrees, a cocksuredness, and a readiness to measure and sum up all things from a limited experience, largely enshrined in sententious traditional wisdom. Tolkien goes on to say, Sam was cocksure and deep down a little conceited, but his conceit had been transformed by his devotion to Frodo. He did not think of himself as heroic or even brave or in any way admirable, except in the service and loyalty to his master. That had an ingredient probably inevitable of pride and possessiveness. It is difficult to exclude it from the devotion of those who perform such service. In any case, it prevented him from fully understanding the master he loved and from following him in his gradual education to the nobility of service, to the unlovable, and of perception of damaged good in the corrupt. He plainly did not fully understand Frodo's motives or his distress in the incident of the Forbidden Pool. If he had understood better what was going on between Frodo and Gollum, things might have turned out differently in the end.
Yeah, I had a hard time reading this quote the first time, just hearing those words, like the vulgarity and the conceit. But it is true that that level of taking something with limited knowledge and making the decision and deciding that in the face of that, you see Sam do it on a number of occasions. And this is what I mean, that even the character that most people turn around and go, oh, well, Sam is the hero. Sam is good and does the right thing, and he does it in an interesting way. Well, yes, he does, because he doesn't always do the right thing or the best thing. He wrestles with his own faults and his own flaws. It's just that the picture that comes out, people tend to like better of Sam at the end. And perhaps because, yes, he is meant to be lovable and laughable, and he is meant to be kind of reachable and and his flaws are more like our flaws. And this is where Tolkien was about to say there about how Sam sort of makes a final error with Gollum, which is that, they have this very tense relationship the entire time. He's often lashing out at Gollum. He's often accusing him of things, which Gollum deserves. But I think the important point is that Frodo, who is in the midst of torment, who is in the midst of this awful, terrible journey that he's on, constantly reaches out to Smeagol with love, with mercy, and with pity, and not unqualified. He recognizes the danger, the evil. He's not blind to Gollum's faults. He's actually very aware of them, but he is responding with a higher feeling. And I think most of us who lash out at people who we find annoying, who struggle to put up with people that we're stuck with all the time, really relate, understandably, to Sam. But it's Frodo who has the higher part there. And not only relating to Sam's reaction, but I think we're a culture that has been raised on Disney and raised on stories where you can identify villains, and Gollum presents as a villain, and Gollum is in a wretched, evil, miserable state when they come upon him. And Sam does what we like to do as well and goes, well, you look like a villain and you are a villain. And Frodo does what we are called to do by Christ, which is to be open and to extend forgiveness 70 times, 7 times, and to be Christ to all. And that's far harder and doesn't present well to the world. No. In fact, I wonder how much of the rejection of Frodo is the rejection of the extent to which we are called to virtue, that we don't want to hear that. And that word villain is so important, because Tolkien was about to say in his letter there's this key moment that I've already referenced where Sam and Frodo are talking about the great stories and their place in them and how they see themselves, and Samwise the stout-hearted and Frodo the brave and all of these things. And it's actually Sam who says,
even Gollum might be good in a story. And then he goes on to say, do you think he thinks of himself as the hero or the villain? And then they go on to talk about it a little bit more and what they expect Gollum is about to do. He's quote unquote sneaked off, and they say he's probably going to betray us, but we have to keep going with him. And again, like, presents Frodo as very clear-eyed about Gollum. And Sam invites Frodo to fall asleep on his lap, and there's this like almost sort of angelic painting of the two of them. Sam also falls asleep, and Gollum comes back, and he's just betrayed them to Shelob. He's gone up to Shelob, he's laid the foundations for what he's about to do with his great betrayal, but he comes back and he sees them in that moment, and to Frodo in particular, he responds with love. And there's this really heartbreaking moment where it says, if the sleepers could see him. Do you have the quote?
Mm-hmm. Then he came back, and slowly putting out a trembling hand, very cautiously he touched Frodo's knee, but almost the touch was a caress. For a fleeting moment, could one of the sleepers have seen him, they would have thought that they beheld an old, weary hobbit, shrunken by the years that had carried him far beyond his time, beyond friends and kin, and the fields and streams of youth, an old, starved, pitiable thing. But at that touch, Frodo stirred and cried out softly in his sleep, and immediately Sam was wide awake. The first thing he saw was Gollum, pawing at Master, as he thought. "Hey you," he said roughly, "what are you up to?" "Nothing, nothing," said Gollum softly. "Nice, Master." "I dare say," said Sam, "but where have you been to? Sneaking off and sneaking back, you old villain." Gollum withdrew himself, and a green glint flickered under his heavy lids. Almost spider-like he looked now, crouched back on his bent limbs, with his protruding eyes. The fleeting moment had passed beyond recall.
Tolkien says himself that that is the pivotal moment. That is kind of the last moment that Gollum has for redemption. And Sam he spoils it, like he ruins it. And he uses, it's funny, Gollum picks up on that word sneak and starts using it against Sam, but it's actually in there that Jacob pointed out, you old villain. Like, Sam has just been talking about whether Gollum sees himself as a hero and a villain, and then Sam himself puts him in the villain box. Mm-hmm. And he takes that up, and Frodo actually says, in reference to sneak, but says that like, oh, you shouldn't adopt names for yourself. And it's almost like Sam has put him into that box in that moment and keeps him there.
Mm-hmm. That question. I wonder if he thinks he's the hero or the villain. "Gollum," he called, "would you like to be the hero?" Now where's he got to again?
Yeah. It's almost like those two sentences are bookmarked. Like, there's more text in the book between those two moments, but like you could almost have one and then pick the other straight up.
But where have you been to? Sneaking off and sneaking back, you old villain.
Yeah. And it's funny because out of all of the confrontations between Sam and Gollum, that's actually the one where I think on like a pure basic level, Sam comes out of the best. Mm-hmm. He immediately apologizes 3 times to Gollum.
Sam felt a bit remorseful, though not more trustful. "Sorry," he said. "I'm sorry, but you startled me out of my sleep, and I shouldn't have been sleeping, but that made me a bit sharp. But Mr. Frodo, he's that tired, I asked him to have a wink, and, well, that's how it is. Sorry. But where have you been to?" "Sneaking," said Gollum, and the green glint did not leave his eyes.
Right. And even then, afterwards, Sam makes a joke where he says, well, I guess we all better be sneaking off. So to me, there's like 3 elements of Sam trying to reach out. He apologizes 3 times. He actually owns up to his own fault. Like, the reason I lashed out was because I did something wrong. And then he tries to include himself with Smeagol and says, well, I said you were sneaking, but, actually all of us need to be sneaking. So it's not that it's you and us, it's all of us. Mm-hmm. And none of those things, as much as they are good, repair that moment. And it's because Sam, the whole way along, has had this attitude with Gollum where he lashes out, he says bad things to him, he thinks bad thoughts about him. Mm-hmm. And so even when he's got his temper under control the best, he has still reacted in that moment that seals the fate both of Gollum but also of Frodo, because then Frodo doesn't have Gollum's help, which he could have. There's a world that Tolkien posits about what might happen if that moment hadn't happened.
And I think, it's really important that, Sam felt a bit remorseful, though not more trustful. Mm-hmm. And that Frodo is extending this trust and that Sam is not and never does, really, or at least, not beyond the point of no return.
Yeah.
And we're called, people bring up fairly often from scripture the be cunning as serpents and gentle as doves. But our nature really calls us all the time to be cunning as serpents. And it is by far the more rebellious thing in life to be gentle and to extend that trust. And it's harder, and it's so not what we're conditioned to do, again, by the stories we read, by the films we watch. We look at Gollum and we see something contemptible, and Frodo looks and sees someone not unlike himself.
And I think it's so telling that there are all like differences of situations. Sam is startled awake, whereas he gently wakes Frodo. But when Frodo wakes in this interchange, he sits up and he says, "Hello, Smeagol. Found any food? Have you had any rest?" Like, there's just an extension of dignity and kindness that comes from Frodo. And I think it's all the more telling because of the way in which he has this unbelievable burden. And I think that's the other big thing that I want to get to, is just a misunderstanding or a minimizing of what Frodo is going through. I don't think the book does. I think the book tries to keep it very present in your mind, but it's so easy to be like, yeah, he's carrying the ring. He has to walk. Everybody has to walk. It's a tough walk. Maybe it's like extra heavy around his neck, but that's it. And instead, what Frodo is going through is this unrelenting torment from outside and inside that is happening to him at all times, which makes his constant extension of kindness and sympathy and thought for others all the more remarkable.
I think this is an easier one to get lost in if one's only point of reference is the films, because it's very hard to convey in film the internal mental anguish and torment and suffering. Instead, we see what people tend to accuse Frodo of. We get a lot of, Frodo just faints all the time, because that was kind of the clearest visual representation they could give of like this thing deeply affecting him. And this is no complaint about the films. It is a very hard thing to convey, and even within the books it is subtly conveyed often. But one of my favorite things rereading recently has been noticing how often Tolkien uses very small phrases and words to show you how deeply Frodo is affected from the very beginning. So this is really the first time where peril meets Frodo, Pippin and Sam on the road after they leave the Shire. And we've already seen some effects of the ring on Frodo in that he cannot bring himself to, even if he couldn't bring himself to harm it. He intends to cast it into his fire, into the deepest parts of the fire, and he can't bring himself to do it. He ends up putting it back in his pocket, almost against his own will. And then when they leave, they have their first meeting with the Black Rider, and he tells the others to hide, and they get off the road immediately. Frodo hesitated for a second. Curiosity or some other feeling was struggling with his desire to hide. The sound of hoofs drew nearer. Just in time he threw himself down in a patch of long grass behind a tree that overshadowed the road. Then he lifted his head and peered cautiously above one of the great roots. I came back to this after realizing one of the later examples, but this is the first instance of seeing how divided Frodo is from the beginning that I could find. We get a lot of phrases like a stray thought, a wild thought, or here, curiosity or some other feeling was struggling with his desire to hide. And then we see a sudden unreasoning fear of discovery laid hold of Frodo, and he thought of his ring. And I think, again, the choice of unreasoning here is very deliberate. Tolkien chooses his words very carefully. He hardly dared to breathe, and yet the desire to get it out of his pocket became so strong that he began slowly to move his hand. He felt that he had only to slip it on, and then he would be safe. The advice of Gandalf seemed absurd. Bilbo had used the ring, and I am still in the Shire, he thought, as his hand touched the chain on which it hung. Gandalf has laid out so clearly the many, many reasons for not using the ring and how serious that advice is. And Frodo trusts Gandalf deeply, and yet already he is so divided that Gandalf, this wise man who has always been in Frodo's life, can seem absurd.
And I think, to me, you see this like total divided nature actually just before the stairs of Cirith Ungol in those chapters that I've been talking about, where they're watching all of the host of the army pour out of the Morgul Vale, and the Witch King, it has this sort of encounter, like sees him or is looking for him, or is like Frodo is transfixed by the Witch King, and it says, Frodo waited like a bird at the approach of a snake, unable to move. And as he waited, he felt, more urgent than ever before, the command that he should put on the ring. But great as the pressure was, he felt no inclination now to yield to it. He knew that the ring would only betray him, and that he had not, even if he had put it on, the power to face the Morgul King. Not yet. There was no longer any answer to that command in his own will, dismayed by terror though it was, and he felt only the beating upon him of a great power from outside. It took his hand, and as Frodo watched with his mind, not willing it, but in suspense, as if he looked on some old story far away, it moved the hand inch by inch towards the chain upon his neck. Then his own will stirred, forcing it back, and set it to find another thing, a thing lying hidden near his heart. Cold and hard it seemed as his grasp closed on it, the phial of Galadriel, so long treasured and almost forgotten till that hour. So, like, we can see that even against his will, it is working on him. And I think I just am so struck by the way that Frodo is constantly still thinking of others, and I think he gets accused of, the way that Sam is serving him all this time, and that like he's sort of in his own world. And I don't think that's true. I think Sam is absolutely there to facilitate Frodo to do this impossible quest, and that is the right ordering of things. But I don't think it's at all true to say that Frodo is sort of self-caught up, because it has this like terrible description of him, cowering and crying as this huge army goes past him. And then Frodo stirred, and suddenly his heart went out to Faramir. The storm has burst at last, he thought. This great array of spears and swords is going to Osgiliath. Will Faramir get across in time? He guessed it, but he did not know the hour. And I just think, like, to have had that experience with the Witch King, and still to so quickly turn your mind to, what does this mean for somebody I care about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his nature and his heart is so for others, and his motivation in taking the quest is so for the Shire. And then as he goes and meets all these worthy people, it's for them as well. He is motivated out of goodness all the way along, and that stands to him totally. Just more on the division within him. Again, I challenge anyone who thinks we're spinning a yarn to even just read book 1, not even the whole of Fellowship of the Ring, just book 1, the first half, and count up the times that you get these little stray thoughts and wild thoughts. When the hobbits meet Tom Bombadil, and Tom has his interesting interaction with the ring, once again, Frodo has had it reinforced to him, like, not to put on the ring. He's remembered Gandalf's advice, and yet here, even in safety, once Tom gives it back to him, it was the same ring, or looked the same and weighed the same, for that ring had always seemed to Frodo to weigh strangely heavy in the hand. But something prompted him to make sure. He was perhaps a trifle annoyed with Tom for seeming to make so light of what even Gandalf thought so perilously important. And somehow he's forgetting what else Gandalf thought was important, not to use the ring. And he tries it on, and it says when he takes it off, Frodo laughed, trying to feel pleased. He knows that he has given in to something wrong that is pushing on him and pressing on him. And jumping ahead a little further to when the hobbits are trapped by the Barrow Wights in the Barrow Downs, and Merry, Pippin and Sam are all in peril. They are asleep, unconscious, with this sword across their necks, and there is a hand coming towards the sword.
One of the creepiest descriptions in the books.
It's truly horrifying. He heard behind his head a creaking and scraping sound. Raising himself on one arm, he looked, and saw now in the pale light that they were in a kind of passage which behind them turned a corner. Round the corner a long arm was groping, walking on its fingers towards Sam, who was lying nearest, and towards the hilt of the sword that lay upon him. At first Frodo felt as if he had indeed been turned into stone by the incantation. Then a wild thought of escape came to him. He wondered if he put on the ring, whether the Barrow-wight would miss him, and he might find some way out. He thought of himself running free over the grass, grieving for Merry and Sam and Pippin, but free and alive himself. Gandalf would admit that there had been nothing else he could do. But the courage that had been awakened in him was now too strong. He could not leave his friends so easily. And Frodo is in a terrifying situation, one which he barely woke up to try to save his friends from. And he is brave and he is going to save his friends. But even in that moment, he is contending with this ring beating upon his mind and dividing him against himself. He is being riven in two actively and jarringly and horrifically. And he has to do all of these difficult, brave things while less than himself, while a man turned against himself.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes me feel for him so much, is the way in which, if we feel like he's not the most likable, I think he feels himself to know he's not the most likable or not the best version of himself. And the way in which I feel like it comes across of like the guilt he feels of bringing his friends on this quest in service of him, and he is this riven, broken version of himself and knows himself to be. And like the two times where he has those encounters with Sam, there's one time when he's taking the ring back after being captured by the orcs, and Sam has rescued him and brings him the ring, and he has this moment of having to like clutch back at the ring. And then there's a later time when Sam again offers to try and carry it with him or like share the load, and it uses this word you've already used, a wild light came in Frodo's eyes. "Stand away, don't touch me. It's mine, I say, be off." His hand strayed to his sword hilt. So unusual for Frodo to like react in violence. But his hand strays to his sword hilt. But quickly his voice changed. "No, no, Sam," he said sadly. "But you must understand, it's my burden." Like it comes across again and again, that first time when he's been rescued and he's so pleased that Sam has brought him the ring and has saved the quest. "You've got it," gasped Frodo. "You've got it here. Sam, you're a marvel." Then quickly and strangely his tone changed. "Give it to me," he cried, standing up and holding out a trembling hand. "Give it to me at once. You can't have it." "All right, Mr. Frodo," said Sam, rather startled. "Here it is." Slowly he drew the ring out and passed the chain over his head. "But you're in the land of Mordor now, sir, and when you get out you'll see the fiery mountain at all. You'll find the ring very dangerous now and very hard to bear. If it's too hard a job, I could share it with you, maybe." "No, no," cried Frodo, snatching the ring and the chain from Sam's hands. "No, you won't, you thief," he panted, staring at Sam, his eyes wide with fear and enmity. Then suddenly, clasping the ring in one clenched fist, he stood aghast. A mist seemed to clear from his eyes, and he passed his hand over his aching brow. The hideous vision had seemed so real to him, half bemused as he was, still with wound and fear. Sam had changed before his eyes into an orc again, leering and pawing at his treasure, a foul little creature with greedy eyes and slobbering mouth. But now the vision had passed. There was Sam kneeling before him, his face wrung with pain as if he had been stabbed in the heart, tears welling from his eyes. "Oh, Sam," cried Frodo, "what have I said? What have I done? Forgive me. After all you have done, it is the horrible power of the ring. I wish it had never been found. But don't mind me, Sam. I must carry the burden to the end. It can't be altered. You can't come between me and this doom." "That's all right, Mr. Frodo," said Sam, rubbing his sleeve across his eyes. "I understand. But I can still help, can't I? I've got to get you out of here." That interaction is just so heartbreaking and so painful, and so shows how much Frodo is aware of the lesser version he is with this extra burden.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, we've seen his care for everyone all the way along as he's under this enormous strain, and he does begin to break down. He is, it is again a real splitting. It is a real division, and we see that in Gollum. We see the end point of that division, the full split personality between the traitor Gollum and the hobbit Smeagol. And there's such fear of knowing that is the path, that is where this leads, and it is actively happening to Frodo every step of the way. And yet again, that while there is possessiveness in him seeking to hold the ring, that the desire is a true and a good one, that he needs to complete this task because he has only made it so far because of the nature of the task he has chosen, to make it the entire way to Mount Doom and to destroy the ring. And that Sam taking it in desperation while Frodo was seemingly dead, or taking it there to share it, would not mean the same thing. It would not be the same burden or task or duty or responsibility or vocation that Frodo takes and has taken and still needs to fulfill. And Frodo can only resist for so long as he is pursuing that task and that aim.
Yeah, and there's a stick-attedness that is necessary. As much as you want to sympathize with what Sam is saying about, like, I want to share it, that first of all, that's not Sam's role, and he knows that. He says that with the choices of Master Samwise when he takes the ring to begin with, and he's like, oh, I've got it wrong, I'm supposed to be with Frodo. But also there's a shielding that Frodo is doing from his friends. He doesn't want, and he says that at the very end, you have many years to be whole, Sam. He doesn't want Sam to be divided in the way that he is divided. And so he's shielding Sam, but also there's a certain level at which, as awful as it sounds, it's in the never wavering, constant dedication to the task that means not taking a break, not putting it on others, not sharing the load, that is necessary because there's just this sense of like him constantly taking one more step and one more step. And I feel like that's where one of the complaints of him is this like complainingness of him, his whininess, as you said. And what that comes from is to convey how every single step that he takes is a burden to him.
There's something to the image of, when people work out, when people go running, that, yeah, it's burning and yeah, you don't want to stop, but it is actually better for you to keep moving, even if you need to slow down a little and to continue the run. Could you imagine how awful it would be to remove this burden in the worst place on earth and really receive no real respite? There's not going to be an elven spa for him to visit and get a bit of a rest. It's going to be more toil, and then to once again take up the load of the ring, it would only make things worse. He needs to go to the end. And also, again, in thinking of the quest as something vocational, again, there's something so stark and insane if you put it in those terms. If you say to a married person, oh, here, let me take up your marriage for a while and help you with that. Or as much as we try to support a priest in his ministry, we can't be the priest for him. And that's the nature of this task, that when they set out from Rivendell, 8 people had the task of aiding the ring bearer for so far as they were willing to go, and one of them had the task to carry the ring to Mount Doom, and that was Frodo.
And I think I want to pull one quote out from the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, where I just want to show how early this like absolute paralyzing fear that he has is very clearly on him, where they're discussing, he's trying to quote unquote make this decision about what he's going to do. And of course it's Sam who understands him the best. And I've said that Sam doesn't fully understand him, but it is Sam who understands him the best out of everyone. And he says, "Begging your pardon," said Sam, "I don't think you understand my master at all. He isn't hesitating about which way to go. Of course not. What's the good of Minas Tirith anyway? To him, I mean." And then he goes on to say, "But Mr. Frodo, he knows he's got to find the cracks of doom if he can. But he's afraid. Now it's come to the point he's just plain terrified. That's what his trouble is. Of course, he's had a bit of schooling, so to speak. We all have since we left home. Or he'd be so terrified he'd just fling the ring in the river and bolt. But he's still too frightened to start. And he isn't worrying about us either, whether we'll go along with him or no. He knows we mean to. That's another thing that's bothering him. If he screws himself up to go, he'll want to go alone. Mark my words.
And just because it ties in again with these roles, just after that, Aragorn says, Pippin says, "Stop him, don't let him go." And Aragorn says, "I wonder. He is the bearer, and the fate of the burden is on him. I do not think that it is our part to drive him one way or the other, nor do I think that we should succeed if we tried. There are other powers at work far stronger." He knows what his part in this fellowship is, even though, again, he's the movie poster hero. He's the ranger from the north coming to reclaim his kingship. He's got a broken sword. He's Viggo Mortensen, ladies and gentlemen. But he knows that his part is to let Frodo decide and to follow and aid and support for as long as he can and as long as he is able.
Yeah, and I think it's this question of Frodo wanting to do it on his own is not from a space of self-sufficiency. It's from a space of, again, wanting to shield his friends, knowing that his role is literally to just keep going and there's only so much they can do to support him, and preferring to walk it alone rather than expose them to that journey.
And that's, I will always cry in the films with the I'm going alone. Of course you are, and I'm going with you.
There's a reason we love Sam. There's such a beautiful, strong reason to love Sam.
But in that, desire to shield, desire to care, his love for all the members of the Fellowship, Boromir included, that Frodo decides to do this. And it brings to mind something that happens in the end of Harry Potter. So, spoiler warning for both the film Deathly Hallows Part 2 and the book Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. But there's a key difference between the film and the book when Harry knows that he needs to go to his doom, to his death in the Forbidden Forest. And in the film, they show us, to get you in that heart-wrenching space, they show Harry meeting Ron and Hermione as he's heading on his way. And they have Hermione saying, "We'll go with you, I'll come with you." And he says, "No, you can't. You need to stay. I have to go alone." And it does make you cry. It is, emotionally effective, but the book, I feel, is much more true to the reality and is much closer to what happens with Frodo. Harry is under the invisibility cloak going to the forest, and he knows that if he sees Ron or Hermione, he won't be able to go, that he won't have the strength, that he needs to just do this without, he certainly can't talk to them. And he knows he needs to give instructions before he leaves, but it needs to be without telling anyone his plan, and he needs to not see his best friends in the world before he goes. And there's so much of Frodo in that moment of knowing that you have to do the hardest thing, and you have to do the hardest thing without the people you love because you love them too much.
Yeah. I'm just struck of how much he is called to go it alone, and that there is only to a certain degree how much anyone can help. And I think there's a Flannery O'Connor quote that I think of all the time where it says that illness is a place more instructive than a trip to Europe, and it's a place that nobody can follow and that there's no company there. And I think, again, that's so telling of Frodo, because there is only a certain extent, Sam does absolutely everything he can up to the point of carrying him, but that's the point. He can't carry the ring, only Frodo can do it. And the extent of the absolute agony that he's in in that journey is like, yeah, you can probably hear it in my voice. I find it hard to read. There's this one description of it that I think kind of sums up some of like the absolute torment that he's in. And I think I pointed out to you, Jacob, that there's a description when they're on the slopes of Ord Ruin, and Sam says it was a torment more than he thought you could ever bear. And that's just Sam without the ring, without any of those elements, in such a place of absolute devastation. And yet here's Frodo with this splitting of his personality. And I think Tom Shippey does a good job of delineating out the portrayal of evil in Lord of the Rings, where it is both something outside of you that's oppressing you, that's tempting you, that's a force that has to be reckoned with outside of you, and yet at the same time also something that's working on the worst parts of you on the inside. And so it's this experience that is both external and interior at the exact same time, and plays on all of the same things that Sam is struggling with, like the deprivation, the physical discomfort, is amplifying all of those things. And Frodo just does that most brave thing of like literally just keeping going. So this is the description where it's in the plains of Gorgoroth, and it says, "But far worse than all such perils was the ever-approaching threat that beat upon them as they went, the dreadful menace of the power that waited, brooding in deep thought and sleepless malice behind the dark veil about its throne. Nearer and nearer it drew, looming blacker, like the oncoming of a wall of night at the last end of the world. There came at last a dreadful nightfall, and even as the captains of the West drew near to the end of the living lands, the two wanderers came to an hour of blank despair. 4 days had passed since they had escaped from the orcs, but the time lay behind them like an ever-darkening dream. All this last day Frodo had not spoken, but had walked half-bowed, often stumbling, as if his eyes no longer saw the way before his feet. Sam guessed that among all their pains he bore the worst, the growing weight of the ring, a burden on the body and a torment to his mind. Anxiously, Sam had noted how his master's left hand would often be raised as if to ward off a blow or to screen his shrinking eyes from a dreadful eye that sought to look in them. And sometimes his right hand would slowly creep to his breast, clutching, and then slowly as the will recovered mastery it would be withdrawn. Now, as the blackness of night returned, Frodo sat, his head between his knees, his arms hanging wearily to the ground, where his hands lay feebly twitching.
As I was walking over here today, I was really thinking about that endurance under siege. And I don't want to keep going vocational, but we are baptized like into the threefold ministry of Christ as priest, prophet, and king. And within Lord of the Rings, Frodo fills this priest space of the one tasked with this vocation of destroying sin, of offering this sacrifice, of making the ultimate Christ-like sacrifice, and offering his life in the balance. And I was thinking about Hebrews, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And I think about those words a lot, about Christ enduring and despising the shame. And again, in Frodo, I think we see that endurance and hatred of what he's becoming and what he has to do and what it's doing to him and what it's doing to the people around him. And Frodo is not a Christ one-to-one figure by any means. No one in Lord of the Rings is. But it opens up in a very human way that aspect of Christ to us, and that what it means on our level as broken, imperfect people, and that relentless trudge under heavy fire, under shame that you despise, to the joy that was set before him. And for Frodo, in his eyes, there isn't a joy. He doesn't expect to make it home. He doesn't expect reward. He hopes for things, but he has no reasonable expectation of them.
Yeah, and I think at this point in the story, he also even says that he knows that destroying the ring will drive him mad, because he says, if I had to give up the ring, it would drive me mad. And so he's going knowing that the very act of succeeding will destroy him. So even in the world in which he's quote unquote succeeds, he knows he will not come through that. And I think, this question of endurance, like when you read the section from the Barrow-wights where he says, even Gandalf would say that he couldn't be blamed. And it's so easy, there's such a temptation to say that you've reached the point of endurance before you actually have. And surely, us humans do look at it and we would say, you wouldn't blame him. He'd come out of that and you'd say, no, you couldn't have done anything more. But actually, Frodo's place is to keep saying no to that inclination and to keep going even beyond what anybody would reasonably say that he could be expected to do. And there's this point where they're looking across the plains of Gorgoroth and they can just see all of these hosts of orcs. And Sam says, we can't do it. There's no way down. I can't see a way. And Frodo says, still we have to try. It's no worse than I expected. I never hoped to get across. I can't see any hope of it now. But I've still got to do the best I can. At present, that is to avoid being captured as long as possible. There's this avoidance of saying, well, we got this far, but there's no way forward. It's to keep going to the point of destruction. And it's only then that he actually reaches the end. And we get to this key point of Frodo of him being a failure. And this is where Tolkien himself comes in with such grace and such beauty when he talks about Frodo as a failure, the way that he gets to that point and ultimately doesn't give up the ring, and how that is both a failure but also representative of Frodo's success, which is to not call it quits too early, to get to the point at which he has to fail, is bound to fail, because ultimately the Lord of the Rings is showing us that evil is not overcomable by humans. It is only through God that it is actually overcome. And so we see the point of all of Frodo's efforts, which are aided by grace, but are his own efforts. And ultimately, that is not sufficient to overcome evil. And so in the cracks of doom, he quote unquote fails. But it is both God and then Tolkien in writing the story that extends the mercy and pity that Frodo has been showing the whole way along the story to Frodo himself. I mean, I think he addresses it in about 3 or 4 of the letters, and all of them, we could read out all of them.
Truly.
But maybe this one. I do not think that Frodo's was a moral failure. At the last moment, the pressure of the ring would reach its maximum. Impossible, I should have said, for anyone to resist, certainly after long possession, months of increasing torment, and when starved and exhausted. Frodo had done what he could and spent himself completely as an instrument of providence, and had produced a situation in which the object of his quest could be achieved. His humility, with which he began, and his sufferings were justly rewarded by the highest honour, and his exercise of patience and mercy towards Gollum gained him mercy. His failure was redressed. We are finite creatures with absolute limitations upon the power of our soul-body structure in either action or endurance. Moral failure can only be asserted, I think, when a man's effort or endurance falls short of his limits, and the blame decreases as that limit is closer approached. Nonetheless, I think it can be observed in history and experience that some individuals seem to be placed in sacrificial positions, situations or tasks that, for perfection of solution, demand powers beyond their utmost limits, even beyond all possible limits for an incarnate creature in a physical world, in which the body may be destroyed or so maimed that it affects the mind and will. Judgments upon any such case should then depend on the motives and dispositions with which he started out, and should weigh his actions against the utmost possibility of his powers along the road to whatever proved the breaking point.
I want to keep going a tiny bit there. Frodo undertook his quest out of love, to save the world he knew from disaster at his own expense, if he could, and also in complete humility, acknowledging that he was wholly inadequate to the task. His real contract was only to do what he could, to try to find a way, and to go as far on the road as his strength of mind and body allowed. He did that. I do not myself see that the breaking of his mind and will under demonic pressure after torment was any more a moral failure than the breaking of his body would have been, say, by being strangled by Gollum or crushed by a falling rock. And I just wanted to go that far because that's so stark. Again, that this was not in his hands. It was so out of his hands at this point. He had won the race, really. He had gone the distance.
Yeah.
And now he was only in the hands of fate.
Yeah. And I just think it's so moving. And I think I want to maybe spend a little bit more time on that, but just we've brought in one of the elements there, which is his motives. And I think that's one of the things that is so lovable and so likable about him, which is like the purity of his motives. Yeah, I think you have a quote. Do you, Jacob?
When he is first kind of commissioned by Gandalf to, told by Gandalf what the ring is, he leaves Frodo to infer a lot of what needs to happen. And Frodo says, "I suppose I must keep the ring and guard it, at least for the present, whatever it may do to me." And Gandalf says, "Whatever it may do, it will be slow to evil if you keep it with that purpose." And then Frodo continues, "I hope so, but I hope that you may find some other better keeper soon. But in the meanwhile, it seems that I am a danger to all that live near me. I cannot keep the ring and stay here. I ought to leave Bag End, leave the Shire, leave everything and go away. I should like to save the Shire if I could, though there have been times when I thought the inhabitants too stupid and dull for words, and have felt that an earthquake or an invasion of dragons might be good for them. But I don't feel like that now. I feel that as long as the Shire lies behind, safe and comfortable, I shall find wandering more bearable. I shall know that somewhere there is a firm foothold, even if my feet cannot stand there again. Of course, I have sometimes thought of going away, but I imagined that as a kind of holiday, a series of adventures like Bilbo's or better, ending in peace. But this would mean exile, a flight from danger into danger, drawing it after me. And I suppose I must go alone, if I am to do that and save the Shire. But I feel very small and very uprooted and, well, desperate. The enemy is so strong and terrible." And I get grumpy at Gandalf for leaving it a full 2 paragraphs before telling him, "But I don't think you need go alone." But that Frodo immediately, in order to save the Shire and do what he must, is willing to take this on and go alone. And from very early on, you also see that he knows that, particularly from the council onwards, but he knows that the likelihood is he won't come back, that this will be his death.
Yeah. And I think it's so moving because I think he wrestles, first of all, that like so many of the company, that like the Aragorns and even the Boromirs, go out to kind of meet the things that they want to achieve and the ends that they want to have. And for Frodo, the only thing that he desires is the very thing that he's leaving behind, and leaving behind in such a way that he will never be at home there anymore. And I think he knows that. And I think it's interesting because I think being the most un-Hobbit like Hobbit, I think there's always an element of him that is slightly at odds. That's what he's saying, that like, you know, I do recognize the limitations of the Shire and the Hobbits there, but that like it's still where his heart is and where he wants to reside, and that's the thing he's leaving behind, and that's the thing he's giving up. But I think it's also interesting that he does have that like tiny element of like the most human of, you know, selfish desires, which is to just feel like somebody in the world knows that he did the right thing. And I just think so much of, you know, I've made this joke already this year. It's my podcast. I'll quote T.S. Eliot if I want to. I've quoted Flannery O'Connor. I've quoted The Once and Future King. We're talking about Tolkien. This is really the absolute Rachel's collection of personal obsessions, but
these are a few of your favorite things.
Exactly. So with my favorite things is not only T.S. Eliot, but Murder in the Cathedral, one of my favorite texts ever. But in it, St. Thomas Becket is tempted by a series of tempters, just like Christ in the desert. He goes through 3 temptations, and then the 4th comes, and he was like, I wasn't expecting the 4th, because of course in the desert the devil tempts Jesus 3 times. But there's this 4th tempter who says, yes, become a martyr so that you will become a famous saint and people will revere you through the ages. And it's this really cruel element to throw into his thinking at that point. He says, you know, who are you tempting me with my own desires? And the tempter replies, I offer what you desire. I ask what you have to give. Is it too much for such a vision of eternal grandeur? And Thomas replies saying, "You offer only dreams to damnation." And the tempter says, "You have often dreamt them." And Thomas says, "Is there no way in my soul sickness that does not lead to damnation and pride? I know that these temptations mean present vanity and future torment." But later, when he's resisted this temptation, he says, "The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason." And where I think about this is, after that interaction I described with Frodo and the Witch King in the Morgul Vale, and he thinks about Faramir, and he says, is Faramir going to be okay? And he has this moment of despair where he says, "And who can now hold the fords when the King of the Nine Riders comes, and other armies will come? I am too late. All is lost. I tarried on the way. All is lost. Even if my errand is performed, no one will ever know. There will be no one I can tell. It will be in vain." Overcome with weakness he wept, and still the host of Morgul crossed the bridge. Frodo raised his head and then stood up. Despair had not left him, but the weakness had passed. He even smiled grimly, feeling now as clearly as a moment before he had felt the opposite, that what he had to do, if he could. And whether Faramir or Aragorn or Elrond or Galadriel or Gandalf or anyone else ever knew about it was beside the purpose.
It's such a real wrestling and a true one, and it's so hard, and it feels like such a fair desire. And it is so hard that not only does he stay true and kind of abandon his attachment to that idea, but in many ways, yes, he is rewarded at the end, but not with that he is not recognized when he goes home. He's been recognized by Aragorn and Arwen and Éowyn and Faramir and Éomer and Gandalf and many of the wise and wonderful of the world, but they're as far removed from his home as the saints and angels in heaven are from us almost. It's a different world he's occupied, and when he comes home, Merry and Pippin are beloved for coming in and kind of sweeping the ruffians out of the Shire, and Sam is beloved for bringing the dust from Lothlorien and the seed, and for kind of helping the Shire get back to normal. And Frodo just came back, and people don't talk of his deeds. They don't really care. They don't know. They don't understand. And for him to have done the hardest thing and taken the hardest road and endured it all, and then to have experienced the bitterness of perceived failure at the final hurdle, only to undo the great evil and then come home and nobody cares, it seems so deeply unfair.
It does. And it's hard to feel like, I have to kind of remind myself of the gift that going to the Undying Lands is, that it is a gift and that is an honor and that is something that is healing and good for him, because it just feels like he pours out everything and gets nothing, It
feels like you gave everything for everyone and now you don't belong here. Get out.
Yeah.
It's really hard, and I almost can't imagine reading these books, and there are many people with different and no faith who read and value these books, but I almost can't imagine what the non-spiritual dimension of that ending is. How do you interpret the gift of the Undying Lands without knowing that Frodo stayed true to the higher calling and the higher purpose, and that this will be reward and rest and peace?
Yeah. And I think it's also just so moving to me that, and I think we want to speak a little bit more about how his friends see him, but in the moment where Sam and Frodo are having this back and forth about the great tales and tell me about Mr. Frodo and the ring, and Sam says, "Tell me about Frodo, the famousest of all the hobbits." And it's so heartbreaking that that's what Sam wants for Frodo, because Sam sees who Frodo is and what he has endured and what he has done, and wants that recognition for him after everything that he's done. And it hurts Sam to see that that's actually not what Frodo gets. And I think, to me, what that says is the recognition in his friends of who Frodo is at his core, that all of the despair, and the weakness and the brokenness and the moments of lashing out and the moments of where he does have to be to a certain level self-obsessed because it has to just, his task is to get himself further. They see all of that, but they also see the whole picture of the good person that chose to take that on.
Mm-hmm. And again, not to circle back to why people find Frodo unlikable, but again, we get presented with a picture of him and so much is removed and taken away in this journey. His qualities are so good. He's so good humored. For anyone listening who may not have read it, congratulations on making it this far. Please read it. Tolkien is hilarious.
Yeah.
And Frodo and Pippin and Merry, their humor just sparkles off the page, particularly at the start of Fellowship. There's so much. And believe me, I was laughing and crying just as hard at the end of Return of the King as I was at the start of Fellowship. But there is so much more laughter than I had remembered from my last reading. And to see, again, the good humour slowly drained out of him because of the onslaught he's under and the burden he has taken on. And to then return, having been to that place, having had it all removed, how do you continue on the same way? How you can't go back. You can't go home. From Tolkien, who had been involved in war, he knew, like, you go through something like that, you are not the same. But he is so admirable and good and fun and lovely, just as much as the others. And we have stuff on that and also on how much his friends love him.
Yeah, I think we maybe have a couple of minutes if you have any particular quotes.
Let's pull some, yeah.
This is running so long, which I'm not surprised because it's me talking about Tolkien. So, of course, it's going on and on. I was thinking, like, I keep coming back to that moment of the exchange of Sam and Frodo talking about the stories on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. And that exchange makes Frodo laugh. And it says that it's the first time that sound has been heard. It's since Sauron entered that place. And yeah, again, like, even in the midst of all of this, he's still laughing. And then for me, at the very end, when he has finally been released of the burden of the ring, the very first thing he says is, the quest couldn't have been completed without Gollum, so let us forgive him. That's the first place that his heart goes to, is like, his finger is now missing and bleeding, but he says, let us forgive Gollum. And he is wonderful and lighthearted, and yet so virtuous and giving and sacrificial.
On a lighter note, the last thing that made me laugh was I was scanning through and I again came to the line where Lobelia Sackville Baggins is leaving Bag End after Frodo has caught her trying to steal things. And she says, "You'll live to regret it, young fellow. Why didn't you go too? You don't belong here. You're no Baggins. You're a brandybuck." "Did you hear that, Merry? That was an insult, if you like," said Frodo as he shut the door on her. "It was a compliment," said Merry Brandybuck, and so, of course, not true. I love the banter they have. They have so much fun together, and I was also laughing when Pippin was calling out for water, and Frodo responded, "I don't keep water in my pockets." But jumping on to when they have left and the conspiracy is unmasked, the concern and the care that Frodo has for his friends and that they have for him is so real and genuine. The hobbits have put in work making a new home for Frodo to keep up this pretense that Frodo is only moving house and not leaving the Shire. Frodo looked around. It did look like home. Many of his own favourite things, or Bilbo's things, were arranged as nearly as possible as they had been at Bag End. It was a pleasant, comfortable, welcoming place, and he found himself wishing that he was really coming here to settle down in quiet retirement. It seemed unfair to have put his friends to all this trouble, and he wondered again how he was going to break the news to them that he must leave them so soon, indeed at once. Yet that would have to be done that very night before they all went to bed. And Frodo at this point has already looked at many places in the Shire and kind of gone, is this the last time I'm going to see you? And he knows he likely will never come back. And he has to do that hardest thing and to his very best friends tell them, I'm going and I don't think I'm ever coming back. And then is met with nothing but love from them, love and care. they've had a conspiracy and they have been in his business and they know too well that he is going. And Merry says, "You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin, to the bitter end, and you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself, but you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We are your friends, Frodo. We are horribly afraid, but we are coming with you, or following you like hounds."
Yeah, the response of the other hobbits to Frodo gives you such insight into who Frodo is. And I think that that's really key. I think that's another way in which Tolkien tells you about someone without just describing it, which is to give you wonderful, admirable characters and have them admire and love and care for another character and have that inform you of who that person really is.
And for, the lovers of Bilbo and Gandalf at the Barrow-wights, it notes that Gandalf and Bilbo believed Frodo to be the best hobbit in the Shire, though he did not know it. And again, their high regard matters so much. Like this character who's constantly presented to us as the wise, and previously, the eponymous Hobbit, the Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, thinks Frodo is the best Hobbit.
Yeah.
And also, I love this from Merry before the full conspiracy is revealed. "You must remember that we know you well and are often with you. We can usually guess what you are thinking. I knew Bilbo, too. To tell you the truth, I had been watching you rather closely ever since he left. I thought you would go after him sooner or later. Indeed, I expected you to go sooner, and lately we have been very anxious." That presence of care and how involved his friends are in his life and he in theirs is beautiful and a real testament of real friendship and Tolkien valuing real friendship. And one more thing before I drag us into a third hour.
Much like the movies.
At the very end of all things, I was really struck by the significance of Frodo going on alone and into the Grey Havens, not alone, accompanied by other people, but leaving the three hobbits at the Havens, watching after the ship. And Tolkien in the war, he writes that, all his friends, like he was really the only one who came back physically whole, and it certainly was mentally and spiritually deeply impacted and wounded by his experiences, but all his friends were killed or badly maimed and injured for the rest of their lives. And again, for Frodo to have gone through this whole experience and then to not have his friends with him at the end, there's something so real about that, and it's heartbreaking every time you come to it. But the love that is there in that final journey of Sam to the Grey Havens to bring Frodo there, and the closeness of their bond is it. How can you not love Frodo when presented with that depth of love and that depth of common experience that they share, and extraordinary, uncommon common experience that they have been through, the trial that they have been through.
Yeah, and that, we've mentioned it already, but that sense of how divided and how torn he's been and how much he doesn't want to have that extend to the people he loves. That line where Sam says, "And I can't come to the Havens? No, Sam, not yet anyway, not further than the Havens, though you too were a ring bearer, if only for a little while. Your time may come, do not be too sad, Sam. You cannot always be torn in two. You will have to be one and whole for many years. You have so much to enjoy and to be and to do." "But," said Sam, and tears started in his eyes, "I had thought you were going to enjoy the Shire too, for years and years, after all you have done." "So I thought so too once. But I have been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. But you are my heir, and all that I had and might have had, I leave to you."
If you're not already teary with us, one more thing of Tolkien and his life that I came across recently was in a letter to Edith, his wife, 2 days before the marriage. Tolkien had quite a difficult life. He was a double orphan. He was raised between an orphanage and then a priest, but a collection of priests, and having just his brother and for family, and then war, and he almost dies, and then he's quite poor, and then a second war, and all of this hardship. And he writes to Edith 2 days before the marriage, "The next few years will bring us joy and content and love and sweetness such as could not be if we hadn't first been two homeless children and had found one another after long waiting." And I think in Frodo, in the hardship, that love, that same love and sweetness just comes out and radiates from everything, from all that they go through, and from the hardship, the finding of the light in there.
Yeah, I think so. So before I've managed to get this far without actively crying. So
she's so close, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm so close. So I guess we should probably wrap it up there. I know this has gone so long that I think, Jacob, you're now running late for something. But very quickly, can you tell me something you're enjoying at the moment?
Oh, God, I didn't prepare for this. Oh, no. What am I enjoying at the moment? Okay.
If you like, I can go first. What do you
Go
think?
first, please.
I also forgot, but...
It's the one format.
But I will say, I think I referenced reading Dickens already this year, but not necessarily this particular Dickens. So I've been reading Little Dorrit. I'm only like halfway through. I'm still getting to grips with what the story is and where it's going. But I just want to call out again how great Dickens is and how much, again, care and attention that he gives to the way that he describes things, and throws in so many details and so many little moments that are so funny and so telling and so astute that it just makes me so joyful to read him. There was one description of a character called Mr. Myrtle where it talks about him being sort of shy and anxious and all of these things, and it has this incredible description of his hands where it says, "He did not shine in company. He had not very much to say for himself. He was a reserved man with a broad, overhanging, watchful head, that particular kind of dull red colour in his cheeks, which is rather stale than fresh, and a somewhat uneasy expression about his coat cuffs, as if they were in his confidence and had reasons for being anxious to hide his hands," which is such a great way to describe somebody who's got their sleeves pulled down over their hands the whole time. And it's such a clever, funny, astute, and just a throwaway line in an otherwise longer description. And it just makes me love Dickens so much, the way that I've described it recently as I feel like reading Dickens is a feast, because you can just keep diving into the details and noticing what else he's doing, and it's uproariously funny and often devastating and, like I said, just very astute. So that's what I'm enjoying at the moment.
That's wonderful. The main thing I've been doing recently has been rereading Lord of the Rings. And I will say I have been deeply enjoying that and noticing so many little details. But to move away from the topic of the episode, I've been doing some work on a D&D campaign that I am hopeful will kick off quite soon. And I think that's been what I've really been enjoying, has been making up the details of this funny little world that hopefully me and some friends will get to play in very soon, and deciding on the fun mechanics that will guide the story. So yeah, if you enjoy narrative storytelling and collaborative storytelling and the introduction of chance into your stories, I'd recommend, just try out D&D. It's not all wizards and spells, although again, Lord of the Rings, we're ones to talk, but it can be a wonderful tool to have fun and tell a story with your friends. It's not a game to win, it's an exercise in storytelling.
That's great. So thank you so much for joining me on this, Jacob.
Thank you for asking me.
This has been both a joy and, like I will say, a pain to do this episode, only because every time I was reading about Frodo, I would be so deeply moved that I would just send messages being like, now I'm in a cafe crying about Frodo. Now I'm sitting on my couch crying about Frodo. It was all the different places and spaces that I might be feeling emotional about Frodo.
I'd love to see a little map with pins and all the places that you cried about Frodo.
But other than that, thank you very much for listening. I wish everyone a very happy and a holy Lent. Of course, as usual, I should encourage you to sign up to my Substack. And if you wish to have a paid subscription, I also, with that, send out a monthly recommendations newsletter. And it's just a very generous way to support me and support this podcast. But other than that, you can follow it on Instagram. I occasionally on Twitter or X, I usually post out whenever there's a new episode. And just thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.